We're still getting reaction, or we will be getting reaction in the next few hours, to the official release of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry's first report, first of 3 volumes that we're going to be reading over the coming months. Let's get you a live update now with the Newzroom Afrika senior reporter Tumaule Mohlaudi, who was at the official handover where the Commission chairperson Raymond Zondo Tumaule handed over the report to the President. But as things stand, we're in for a long couple of hours just in trying to see what is actually in the report.
Yes, and certainly it will still be quite a process, as of course President Cyril Ramaphosa alluded to after receiving the report from Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, to say that he will study it extensively, and now that the report is now being released, and in fact it will be available online for everyone in South Africa to be able to see this initial first part of the report that has been released. But the message is clear, and the message from certainly the presidency of the Republic of South Africa is that officials, in terms of the law enforcement side of things, are expected to implement what the letter of the report is about. The report will be looking, of course, at corruption in various state entities. But let's get more on this from Minister in the Presidency himself, Minister Mondli Gugubele. Mr. Gugubele, thank you very much. The first question is basically the availability of the report. We know it will be available online, but we know that South Africa, of course, is one of the most divided societies between the haves and the have-nots. Are there plans to make sure that this report is widely distributed in libraries and other public places in areas where people don't necessarily have ready data for internet and to download the report?
GCIS has obligation to ensure that whatever the government wants to communicate to South Africa, it is accessed by all South Africans across all classes, across all situations. I have no doubt that will be attended to.
And if the message and the call is that officials within the state are expected to act on the letter of the law in terms of the report, does this mean that we will be seeing if there are recommendations, once it's made public fully, to go against high-ranking politicians, this will happen?
Tumelo, the President has already made an undertaking that the recommendations of this report will be implemented. He has made that commitment unwaveringly. We expect nothing to the contrary.
And once it's given through to Parliament, will Parliament be looked upon to basically, in terms of oversight, to be more vigilant? We saw that oversight was one of the issues that came into stark focus at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Will we not see any lapses like we saw in the past?
I think, Tumelo, if you follow recently, our Parliament, in terms of being robust, frank, and tough, recently that has been evolving. We've seen a Parliament that is beginning to take its work serious, and we see no difference when this report comes. We expect that intensity of making the executive accountable to continue. We trust our Parliament in as far as that regard is concerned. In that regard, my apology.
And finally, I mean, we see that this report has been long anticipated, but certainly a very positive moment, as alluded to by President Ramaphosa, in terms of restoring the confidence in governance, in the rule of law in South Africa. This sends a message perhaps also to the rest of the continent.
Listen, the biggest elephant when it comes to state capture is that the question in the minds of South Africans and the globe at large is that, is the government that we vote to power independent? When they make undertakings, should we believe that they will independently implement those undertakings? That's what is fundamental about the state capture. So that's why that positivity is very important, in the sense that the recommendation that comes out, to what degree the state was captured, will go a long way when we implement to turn around that situation.
And certainly this might be also a positive thing for investors to see that South Africa as a country is a country that believes in the rule of law, and that any dipping of hands into the cookie jar, so to speak, to use that thing, won't be tolerated.
Remember, when investors, both domestic and internationally, when they take decisions to invest in any country, they base it on the policies of that country. But they must have no doubt that there's nothing else other than the policies that are in front of them. So this report, again, will go a long way to clear that confusion.
Minister and President Ramaphosa, thank you very much for speaking to us on Newzroom Afrika. So this is just basically an overview of what can be expected and some of the ripple effects of the release of the first part of the report, and certainly all eyes will be looking towards Parliament in terms of the oversight and how the implementation and basically the access that law enforcement agencies will be given in terms of trying to enforce what will come out of the report. So all eyes in the release, and most importantly, I think also the issue of equitable access dealt with there by Minister in the Presidency, Mondli, saying that the report will be, as far as government is capable of doing, be made accessible to all sectors of society, even those perhaps in areas which are not as economically affluent as other areas. We're talking here about accessibility to data, so to speak, because initially the report will be released and made available online, but certainly libraries and other public spaces in areas where they are not as affluent will also be made available in hard copies. That's an undertaking that government has given here. So with that, it's back to you in the studio.
Very quickly before we go, let's just remind everyone of what we're expecting to hear from this report. The first volume is going to deal with issues related to SAA and related entities. We're also then likely, well, not likely, we're definitely, according to the Chief Justice, going to read about the TNA breakfasts and also the issues of SARS and procurement. Am I right?
Yes, certainly, and that will be dealt with in the first part of the report, and these would be those public SOEs, SAA and SARS. And we know that, of course, with SAA there were a lot of evidence given in terms of contracts given for instance, the catering contracts, and also we had testimony related to how other contracts were taken away in terms of the airlines and its routes and the decisions, how those decisions were reached. So one will be looking very keenly to see exactly what would happen there. Of course, during the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into state capture, we saw that the SAA's top brass was brought in the form of course, Public Enterprises Minister, who was in charge at the time, and of course, Dudu Myeni, who was a chairperson of SAA at the time, answering questions as to how decisions were taken and as to how contracts were also distributed. But then when you look at other particular SOEs which might be of interest would be, of course, a Transnet and how decisions were taken there. Transnet also was involved in the 1056 locomotives deal, a deal that certainly raised very many eyebrows when all these locomotives were then acquired, and when they were brought into the country, it was found that they did not meet the specifications, so you ended up with a lot of infrastructure that could not be used. Already you have PRASA, which is the Passenger Rail Association of South Africa, that is dealing with a backlog and struggling to deal with old infrastructure and updating that infrastructure. But when you have Transnet as a major rail entity in the country, also tasked with dealing and upgrading its infrastructure to ensure that, of course, commuters who rely on rail infrastructure as well as industries are serviced, this in a bid to get the economy working again after a very difficult time in, under the state capture years. This will be questions that will all be dealt with within the initial report that has been released. So certainly a good read for those who will be dipping into the report and downloading it, and when it's available for those who perhaps did not have access to the online platforms, it will be something they will be looking forward to. And again, what is encouraging is the undertaking that government will be looked upon, particularly Parliament, to enforce whatever recommendations are found once the whole report in its entirety is delivered.
Briefly, the issue of the 3 questions from journalists, it's already generating a lot of mixed reaction, shall we say, people saying it appears rather coordinated, the presidency trying to perhaps stage manage the rollout of information from this as far as the briefing. Why 3 journalists and how were they selected?
Well, what happened is it was almost like a round robin hat-picking situation. The journalists were called, and the journalists were asked who would be interested in asking questions, but also advised that there would only be 3 questions that will be allowed, certainly for time. Initially, you would remember that the briefing was meant to have started around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, but there were slight delays to it starting. Of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa and Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo had met on the sidelines to discuss matters around how the communication of the release of the final report, of this initial report, I beg your pardon, would be handled. So journalists were given an opportunity to discuss what questions were there, and if the questions were duplicated, then it made sense for the questions to be asked by one journalist. So this is how this was arrived at, and I don't suspect there was anything untoward about that, because certainly the journalists in the room did agree that the questions that were asked would be asked, because everyone's questions was basically catered to in terms of the questions that were asked by the journalists on hand. And of course, Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gugubele, as he spoke to me moments ago, made himself available in case there were other follow-ups. And certainly the question that I had was a follow-up that I could not pose to the floor, and he answered that willingly. So I don't think there was anything untoward or underhanded in terms of the selection process, in terms of the procedural. I think it was more a time management issue.
Our senior reporter live for us at the Union Buildings. We'll touch base again with you, Dumaula, in the next hour.